So, what is actually happening underneath all the political language that we keep hearing? When borders are weak or inconsistently enforced, the biggest structural winner is not the public. It is not the migrant worker and not even the state. It is large scale corporate capital that gains the most from this setup. The reason is simple. Companies are constantly trying to reduce one of their highest costs, which is labor. If you expand the labor pool beyond citizens into a global, legally fragile workforce, you immediately shift the balance of power in the job market. Workers stop competing on skills alone and start competing on survival. That changes the entire wage structure because employers no longer need to offer competitive salaries because there is always someone more desperate in the system willing to accept less. Over time, this creates downward pressure across entire sectors, not just isolated jobs. So, when people talk about open or porous borders as purely humanitarian or purely political, they are missing the economic mechanism that basically sits underneath it. It is a system that increases labor supply faster than it increases labor protection, and that imbalance is where corporate advantage is created. The second layer is what this does to worker power and collective bargaining. In theory, labor rights exist to balance the relationship between employer and employee. And in practice, that balance depends on workers being able to organize and communicate and act collectively without any fear. But when a large portion of the workforce is undocumented, temporary, or legally uncertain, that foundation breaks down. People in those positions cannot safely join unions or participate in strikes without risking deportation, job loss, or legal consequences. That fear is not accidental in its effect. It directly weakens the ability of workers to negotiate better conditions. It also creates fragmentation inside workplaces where some workers have rights and others do not, even while doing the same job side by side. Corporations benefit from this fragmentation because it removes unified pressure. Instead of negotiating with a strong, coordinated workforce, they are dealing with isolated individuals who have far less leverage. Over time, this does not stop at lowering wages only. It reshapes entire labor markets into systems where compliance is rewarded more than skill, and silence is more valuable than resistance. That is a structural shift in power, not just an employment trend. Then there is the supply chain layer, which is often ignored in public debate, but is central to how global corporations actually operate. Large firms do not just rely on labor flexibility, they rely on jurisdictional flexibility. When borders are weak, it becomes easier to move goods, to move workers, and operations across regions without strong regulatory friction. This allows companies to structure production in a way that avoids higher labor standards or environmental rules or tax obligations in more regulated economies. They can shift parts of the production chain into lower cost, lower regulation environments while still selling to high income markets. Small and medium businesses cannot compete at that level because they are anchored to one jurisdiction and its costs. They cannot relocate factories or restructure global logistics networks to chase regulatory advantages. This creates a structural gap where scale itself becomes a competitive weapon. The larger the corporation, the more easily it can navigate or bypass national constraints. Over time, this leads to consolidation, where smaller competitors are absorbed or pushed out entirely. So, what looks like global efficiency from the outside often translates into local economic displacement on the inside, with fewer independent players controlling more of the market. The political layer is where all of this becomes self reinforcing. Once entire industries become dependent on flexible labor and flexible borders, corporate lobbying naturally shifts toward maintaining that system. Obviously, right? Governments then find themselves under constant pressure to keep borders open or maybe lightly enforced, not just for humanitarian reasons, but because key sectors of the economy are structurally dependent on that labor flow. Agriculture, construction, logistics, and manufacturing often becomes tied to this model. That dependency gives corporations significant leverage in policy discussions, and at the same time, public messaging is carefully shaped to present this as either economic necessity or moral obligation, depending on the audience, depending on the time, depending on the political climate, because it's elections, and so on and so forth, and things of that nature. What is rarely discussed openly is how deeply this ties national policy to private sector stability. Governments start to prioritize short term economic indicators like GDP growth or supply chain continuity over long term wage stability or job security for citizens. That trade off is rarely made explicit to the public, but it is built into how decisions are justified. And over time, this creates a feedback loop where economic independence reinforces policy choices, and policy choices reinforce corporate advantage. When you step back and look at the full system, it stops being a simple debate about borders or migration and becomes a question of economic structure and power distribution. Weak or porous borders do not operate in isolation. They interact with labor markets, corporate strategy, political incentives, and global supply chains all at once. The result is a system where capital becomes more mobile, more powerful, while labor becomes fragmented and less protected. Citizens experience this as wage stagnation, job insecurity, and rising competition for low quality work. Corporations experience it as increased efficiency, lower costs, and higher margins. Those two outcomes are directly connected. The point is not to reduce the issue to political or ideological slogans, but to understand the mechanism beneath it. Because once you see how the system actually functions, it becomes clear that border policy is not confined to geography. Border policy is about who gets to set the rules of labor, who benefits from flexibility, and who carries the cost of that flexibility in their everyday lives. So you are the one who carries the cost at the end of the day. Just in case you were not sure about that.